It's my pleasure today to introduce George Anders, who is the author of this great new book called The Rare Find, Spotting Exceptional Talent Before Everybody Else. Just a few minutes on background for George. He is author of 4 books and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, the Bloomberg View, and actually shared a Pulitzer Prize in 1997 for national reporting. So that's pretty cool. I don't have one of those. That's pretty nice. And he spent 2.5 years researching this book to basically talking to a huge variety of people, from executive recruiters to sports talent scouts to the Army Special Forces to Teach for America to the MacArthur Foundation, just a whole ton of people that are all in the business of finding amazing people, but maybe looking at it in a different way than we're used to. So I think this is particularly relevant for Google, is that we have, as a lot of you guys are recruiters, and we have a very specific way that Google finds people. And as I read through this book, it really sort of turned my world upside down and thinking about a whole bunch of different ways that we should be looking for talent. So we asked George here to kind of talk about a bunch of different ways that he's found. And so look forward to, we're going to do about maybe 40 minutes of Q&A and definitely leave lots of time for you guys to ask questions at the end. So welcome, George.
Thank you. Thanks for the chance to be here.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of start with is just broadly around assessing talent. So you spent a lot of time doing this, assessing talent, and one of the things that you profiled was the puzzle master at Facebook, and just that whole concept of using puzzles to select people. It's something that Google used to do, doesn't do as much anymore, but can you just talk about kind of what you saw from them and how different companies use puzzles?
Sure, glad to. And we need a little bit of context and a little bit of history on this one. Turn the clock back to 2006. And at that stage, Facebook is 20, 25 people on University Avenue. Their recruiting department is, at most 1.5 people. And they know that the best engineers are wanting to come to Google, they're wanting to come to Microsoft. There are other tech companies that are in play, and how in the world are they going to compete? So they can't get to as many campuses as you can, let alone as Microsoft can. They're still selling a story that takes a little while to chew over and figure out, is this going to work or not? And what they wanted was a way to find the unexpected, out-of-the-way, gifted coder who wasn't going to be seen on the usual stops through MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, what have you. And they put up very entertaining and amusing puzzles involving refrigerators full of Red Bull and people with stay-at-home cats and the like, but in the end they all turn out to be database and sorting problems. They just have adorable names to everything, and put them up on their website and said they're open to all comers. And the simple puzzles were an hour, hour and a half to do. The hard ones were 10 hours. I think they had 1 or 2 that they figured were 40-hour puzzles. So one of the things you get when you make your puzzles that long is you find out who really likes to write code. Because it's not enough to just be able to do some of the typical brain teasers that you'll ask in an interview, which identify people who are very quick and facile. This is someone who thinks, why go out Friday night when there's another 150 lines of Python I could be writing? And that's a useful thing to select for. So their showcase discovery on this, and I spend a bunch of time on it in the story, is a guy named Evan Priestley. Evan dropped out of college because it was too easy. So you wouldn't find him looking in college graduates. You also wouldn't find him looking in high school graduates because he never quite finished high school for the same reason. Switched majors 3 times, looking for some field at Southern Maine University that would keep him going. Nothing quite worked, and he ended up in a web development shop and sharpened up his skills on his own, and was a formidable coder in a very out-of-the-way place. I mean, recruiters don't come to Portland. The only reason you're going to be there is because you're there on summer vacation, and then you're not looking for candidates. So what does he do? He answers the puzzle, sends in the solution. It's all automatically coded, so you can tell who solved it right. The good solutions bubble up to the top. They get called for interviews. They come out to Palo Alto. He gets asked the standard questions, and he explains, here's the answer you want, but your code is set up so badly that you're wasting a whole lot of time querying your own database back and forth. If you wrote it better, you wouldn't have this problem, which is total Evan. I mean, manners and diplomacy are not part of his skill set, but really great coding is. So he gets an offer, and he goes on to do great things for him. What I liked about that story is that it spoke to the long tail of talent, because I think we all are in a situation where you can know where the best people are going to be, where you're most likely to find a payoff. And the question is, how much farther do you go? what can you do to track down the people at not just school number 1 or 11 or 21 on your list, but school number 201, or the people who didn't graduate from school number 201. And usually the problem is that such a vanishingly small population that you can't afford to send recruiters out on the road to do presentations at these schools. You may hire one person from them every 10 years. And what this system did was to set up a way to search for those people automatically with just a little bit of storytelling, make it seem appealing to come into this coding environment, and then to bubble up to the top the people who are really going to be good candidates. So nice way to hunt. Not the only way to find programmers, probably only an ancillary way, but one that potentially is quite useful.
So let's talk a little bit about the long tail, because I think that's something that Google, we get thousands and thousands of resumes every day, and we see a lot of the long tail, and a lot of our guys spend a lot of time trying to pick the good ones out of the long tail. And one of the things you talk about was kind of the concept of people who have jagged resumes, and he sounds like somebody who had a bit of a jagged resume. Can you kind of explain the concept of what you think a jagged resume is, and how do we look for people with interesting jagged resumes?
Absolutely. And this is a core idea in the book, and right now we have an environment where we're taught whenever we prepare our own resume of make everything look like an uninterrupted march of success. And each new job is a promotion or at best a broadening lateral transfer. No one ever takes a step back. We always leave to pursue even bigger opportunities. We never get in an argument with the boss, and on and on. But the fact of the matter is some of the most interesting candidates do have zigzags in their resumes, and sometimes, in fact, it's those zigzags that make them stronger. You can look at almost any successful entrepreneur, and part of the reason they're running a company on their own is because they couldn't work for anyone else. You can look at people in new fields, and there may not be anyone with 10 years of experience. People may swoop in from unexpected ways, self-teach themselves what they need to know, and go on to accomplish a lot. So the traditional, call it the McKinsey, Bain model of we're looking for the best graduates from the best schools who did the best internships, may or may not work for them. But especially in technical fields, especially in fast-changing areas, some of your most interesting candidates are going to be people who bounce around. When I do talks far enough outside Silicon Valley, I put up Steve Jobs' resume at 2 different stages, and if I don't put his name on it, I can briefly fool people. And I go, would you fund a guy who was a dropout from Reed College, whose previous business was borderline legal, illegal of hacking into phones, and whose appearance and presentation hardly looked like a successful entrepreneur? And the answer is you bet, you should. And Don Valentine at Sequoia Capital did, and that's worked out enormously well for everyone. But you could come up right there with 3 flags of why this is an imperfect resume and you shouldn't bankroll someone like that. So when I talk about the jagged resume, it's a way of saying loosen up some of those parameters that sometimes are so absolute that you start to miss people who are very interesting on the edge.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all trying to do here, and you profile some interesting people in the book who are particularly good at doing that. And some of them were at the University of Utah.
This is a wonderful story, and it has a pedigree too, as most stories do. When I was getting started on this book, I ended up at a breakfast with Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, and mentioned that I was doing this. And Dr. Grove, as some of you may know, has opinions on everything. They tend to be strong opinions. He is not shy about sharing them. So his advice to me was, you need to go to Utah. You need to figure out how they got good at computer graphics, because that was always a hard area for us, and what was their secret. So 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm on a plane. I land in Salt Lake City. I go into the University of Utah library, and they have all the working papers of the first chairman of the computer science department, David Evans. He was the first chairman and also the first secretary, first janitor, first everything, because it was a one-person department when he got it started. But he showed up in 1965 and set out to look for people who could help him explore the frontier. And that's really the key concept there, is the frontier. At that time, computers were not especially easy to use. I mean, these were still teletype terminals. It was ones and zeros. It was data. And his thinking was there's a whole new realm that could be opened up if we can make this visual. And that meant standing in opposition to 95% of the research at the time, because there were all kinds of things you could do to make computers run faster and process data better. But there was this small tribe that he assembled at Utah that said, we're going to make stuff look good. And he ended up getting the ultimate founders or co-founders of Pixar, of Adobe, Alan Kay, whose work on the Macintosh was very influential, Jim Clark, Silicon Graphics, and Netscape, and they all came in as graduate students for him. All of them were people who had jagged resumes to the extreme. They'd been bouncing around. They'd been in the Navy for a bit. They'd worked for Boeing and got sacked in a round of layoffs. They'd considered going into animation and had dropped that. But what he liked about them was their hunger for discovery, their desire to find something new. And his feeling was, if you've got that level of motivation and passion, I can find the projects for you that will put you on a focus. And in fact, his style was to pose 6-word, 8-word questions of, could you do this? And the first thought was, my God, that's impossible. And the next thought was, you know what, someday it will be possible, and I'd like to be the person who figures out how to do it. So, and it was a talent laboratory like no other one. And an awful lot of it was just looking for these free spirits, unexpected people who just wanted to get to the frontier.
And so when he was able to do that, what have you seen in the kind of talent scouts themselves, their ability to, because we'll see people like that and we could hire them and they could be terrible, but some people are better talent scouts at picking that out and noticing that. What are kind of the characteristics of a good executive recruiter or a good talent scout that you find that these guys could learn from?
So the first concept I want to introduce is managing risk. If you're hiring someone for $1 million a year position with 500 people reporting to them, you better not get that wrong. I mean, there are an awful lot of things that can go wrong there, and that's a big dent to the whole organization. If you're picking up someone for a summer internship or for a contract position for 6 months, you can try a lot more experiments. You can afford to take those long shots, what I in the book call lottery tickets. So I think how you select is important, but also how you evaluate risks and when you know when to play it safe and when you know how to take a chance. At one stage in doing the book, I drew up a whole spectrum chart that stretched, like this, one end of the spectrum to the other of tolerance for risk. And at the far left end, I put airplane pilots. And you really need to land the plane right every time. You can't get someone who's got creative ideas about landing a plane. And then at the other end, I put art galleries. And there, you're looking for something people have never seen before. And in fact, one art gallery operator that I interviewed said his main criteria for who he would display is to ask artists, surprise me. And the people who came up with something nice, that was what he went with. Very successful in his field. You could not run pilot hiring for Delta, United, or American by asking pilot candidates, surprise me. And what they're going to do to the plane just shouldn't be done. So you need to know where you are. And I think that's really the central idea here is evaluate your risks to the position. And we can talk a little bit more about once you decide you're in an area where you can tolerate risk, what to look for. But the key thing is, what's my risk tolerance on this job? And that will vary hugely. I mean, it's a big, long chart.
So can you give us some examples of either companies or organizations where they might have a higher risk tolerance, and what are some of the lottery tickets that they're handing out and making little bets on that might have big payoffs? Like, who's done that well?
Sure. So I got interested in pop music because there you're trying to guess what people want to listen to 6 months from now or a year from now. And knowing current tastes is perhaps some help, but not the key solution. You have to take chances. You have to try artists that are unexpected. Couple things that stood out. Traditionally, a lot of the music finding and signing has been done by people who work in the studios, that you come up the track as someone who develops the artist's sound. I'm seeing a second population that's actually doing quite well, which is the people who manage talent once it's out on the road. Because there are a lot of people who can sound good in the studio, but success may have as much to do with who can connect with a fan base, who tours well, who's a delight on the road and has the stamina for it. I mean, it can burn out artists to a terrifying degree. So I go through the example of how Taylor Swift was discovered. And a couple points that stand out here. She had been briefly signed by one of the biggest labels, which let her go. She was in a $15,000 a year development contract where, at least by her dad's account, there was not a lot of development that was happening. And they were waiting for her to get to 18 or 21. And she thought she could make it on the pop charts faster than that. She ended up getting signed by a very small label of a guy who had just split off from DreamWorks after that part of his career stalled out. And that ability, when you're running something small, to take chances, to open your eyes to someone. He liked her sound at first. It was entertaining. But we sat and flipped through his diary and found the moment where he'd written Taylor is a star. And it wasn't when she first came in. It was after she had gone on a tour to some small Tennessee radio stations without a record out yet, just playing her songs, trying to get station managers to listen to her. And the expectation was you come in, you don't really accomplish anything on the first visit, but you come back 6 months later for another visit, and around the third or fourth time they finally put you on. And she had both the charm and the persistence to say, I'm so glad you like my song. I think this would be a great time for me to play it for your listeners. And the station manager couldn't say no, and she was on the air. And that's when Scott Borchetta, the guy running the label, goes, you know what, this is someone who's going to do very, very well in the world of pop music and is going to build bridges to her fans and the powerful people in the industry that will make her a well-known talent.
So that's kind of interesting because that's something I noticed you talk about, what you call a slight flutter that you might see in the first meeting with somebody. So it's not, I want to kind of dispel the myth that you'll be able to, there are people that can, the first meeting, know this person's bound for greatness, but that they see something that's a slight flutter and then they kind of watch them over time and then place a big bet. How can we get, like I said, thousands of applications a day. How do we look for that slight flutter, knowing that there's other people who are going to be put in front of us the next second? How do you look? What do you look for in that slight flutter?
So it's an interesting question. I mean, I'll offer you an analogy from the book, and then we'll bring it back to the world of technical hiring. So I tracked down the baseball scout who signed Mariano Rivera, who's probably the greatest relief pitcher there's ever been in Major League Ball. And he was originally a shortstop. He's Panamanian. He was playing in a small town in Panama. And the scouting report does not say this guy is going to win the MVP in the World Series. It says this guy might have average or slightly below average major league potential, but I think he's worth a try. His fastball's a little slow right now, but his motion looks smooth, it looks fluid. He looks like someone who could be a good pitcher, and, key insight, he's skinny. He's 6'2" and 160 pounds or something. If he fills out and, once he gets on something other than a Panamanian diet, he could become a lot stronger and more powerful. So I think the key in knowing what to do with the candidates who look slightly interesting is to figure out where is their greatest potential, and is that in a bounded or unbounded area? Sports is kind of a good way to go for this because there you have very obvious physical parameters. I remember watching a high school basketball game. There's one 15-year-old player who was playing well, and the scout said, you know what, he's as good as he's going to get. Look at his muscle development. He's got the body of a 19 or 20-year-old. That's why he's playing well now, but he's fully developed. There's nothing more to come. And it's much harder when we're talking about intellectual skills, mental skills, the like. But I would come back to a list of there are traits like creativity, curiosity, self-reliance. Those tend to be baked in. It's when I was hiring in newspapers, I could never teach curiosity. I said, I can teach you to be a better writer, I can teach you to be a better reporter. If you're not curious about people, I can't build anything there that isn't there. So having clear in your mind what are the skills that I absolutely need to have, and then what are some of the ones that can grow out. If you're talking about, would another couple courses in more advanced computer programming skills, working on different kinds of projects, could this person grow? Being able to gauge growth is really the key. And each field will have its own matrix. I'm not going to try and tell you what the matrix should be for programmers. You know that much better than I do. But that ability to say, here's where I think the fastest growth can happen. Here are the areas where if you're not seeing it at the time that we're interviewing, there won't be much growth to come. I think that helps you find the high potential long shots.
Maybe I'll throw this out as a question for the audience when we get to the Q&A. I would love to hear stories from you guys if you had seen slight flutters in resumes and people who have come here and been successful. What did you notice in the resume and what have they done? So maybe a question for the audience for later. Another concept you talk about in the book that I love personally is resilience. And you give an example from Teach for America about resilience, and I think this is a super important concept. Can you maybe explain what you learned about resilience and maybe talk about that Teach for America example?
Of course. And let me ask to begin with, we've got a relatively young audience here. How many people either considered Teach for America when you were coming through college or had friends who did? Wow. Okay, so you know the organization well. Just to fill in a couple sentences for people who might not know it as well. This is a program that takes graduates from top schools and gives them a chance to teach for a couple years in some of America's most challenging and most needy schools. It's become tremendously competitive. Last year there were close to 50,000 applicants for fewer than 5,000 positions. So they've got an ability to select on whatever screens they want. And in its early years, Teach for America was looking mainly for people with charisma, people who were enthusiastic, energetic presenters. One of their stock questions was, what is wind? And they got people who could give you marvelous answers about the fluttering of angels and the like, but who tended to fall apart in difficult school settings. And you show up somewhere where there's no heating in the winter, or where the textbooks are defaced and missing pages, or where there are 31 desks and 36 kids, and you'll never get a chance to show them all of your wonderful stories and insights and commentary. You're going to be in a position where you're fighting to keep the class's attention. So what Teach for America does now is they look much more for resilience. They look for people who have persevered in their own lives. They look at transcripts differently. Overall grade point is not as important as the slope of your grade point. If you had A's freshman year because you came in very well prepared and then your grades started to go down, that's worrisome. If you started out perhaps from a grittier background yourself with B's first year because you were trying to catch the pace of college and then you took your grades up, that's much more impressive. And then they get to know people's life stories. So one of the ones that I showcase in the book is a woman, Emily Lewis LaMonica, who was a hurdler competitively in college. She only ran for 2 seasons, and I asked her, why's that? And it turns out Teach for America had asked her that too. She had a stress fracture in her foot at the end of freshman year and never should have run again. But she was competitive, she wanted to excel. She worked out an entire training regimen involving mostly swimming pool work to build up her strength, and only stepped on the track twice her sophomore year. The first was to qualify for the Ivy League finals, and the second, when she got to the finals, was to run them. And she ended up turning in Brown's best time that year. So that ability to practice on her own, to set a goal, to work through adversity, and to win recognition, you look at that and you go, you know what? That's someone that we can send to North Miami to a largely Haitian community, and she'll do fine. And sure enough, she ends up being the one who starts the before hours tutoring program for the people who speak mostly Creole and are still learning English. She helps the D and F students figure out how to get C's and B's. And you need an awful lot of resilience to take a student from the very bottom up to the middle. And it's fun to work with the people who are going to be your A and A plus students, but that ability to say, I'm going to make every student a little bit better, even if they're not going to be stars, is extraordinary. So resilience is crucial for them. I think resilience is crucial in almost any job. Hedge funds spend a lot of time trying to figure out who can bounce back from bad investments. And there are lots of people who can make money in a bull market, but it's a much more distinctive element to find someone who can ride out their bad trades, learn from them, and avoid losing all their money in a year like 2008 when the market's just falling apart. Todd had mentioned Army Special Forces. They look for tenacity, resilience, grit obsessively. They send a lot of soldiers into strange valleys in Afghanistan and Iraq that are not well scouted, where you don't know what you're going to find. You're not sure who's a friend, who's an enemy. And you're not going to storm the hill and conquer it for America. This won't be planting the flag on Iwo Jima. This is going to be trying to come to some sort of truce and stable arrangement for a period of months without American food. It's up to you to find the villager with a goat and figure out some way to buy the goat or charm him out of the goat or do whatever you can so you've got something to eat. And resilience even in the jobs that we work in. I mean, think of all the projects that get off to a bad start or get retooled or need to be melded into some different grand plan. And the people who can bounce back from that and say, you know what, that's 2 months of work that went off on a sidetrack, but I'm not done yet, I'm coming back, are going to be people who will be very successful employees. And the people whose feeling is, I gave it one shot, and if they didn't like it, I'm done. That's just going to be much more career limiting.
One of the things with Teach for America that I thought was also interesting is this concept of the audition. And so you profile this with a couple of different organizations. So maybe can you talk about what does Teach for America do for auditions and some of the more intense auditions that you saw, and what do you think an organization like Google should do to help with an audition?
Great. So when I say audition, what I'm really talking about is sustained, careful observation. And sustained, careful observation is too many words, and it lacks sort of the simplicity and the allure of the word audition, but it gets at what's really happening. I mean, you're not just watching someone and then holding up a score at the end that says you're a 9 or you're a 10 and we applaud or we kick you off. What you're really doing is watching the whole panorama of someone's achievement and attitudes, and particularly their execution on the little things. that often this is a great glimpse into people's work habits. And coming back to an earlier part of our conversation, those kind of habits may be the most enduring and the hardest to change. So you want to see someone with good work ethic, commitment to do the little stuff right. In Teach for America's case, they have everyone come in and teach a sample lesson. So I went up to UC Berkeley, and it was the beginning of the recruiting season, so you got the people who were most eager to get a job at TFA, and they all came in the blue suits and the other things that you do in college when you're going for an interview that you really want. And they all had worked up 5-minute lessons. And partway through, one of the Teach for America managers would shoot up a hand and ask a question that was totally from left field. And this was essentially impersonating what's now called the off-task student. When I went to school, these were called troublemakers, but it's the same thing. And you would then have, in live time, 3 or 4 seconds to figure out, do I tell this kid to be quiet? They're interrupting my lesson. Do I try and bring them into the conversation and work with whatever glimmer of hope there is in their answer? Do I stop my lesson entirely and try and do a catch-up lesson for them? And there's some strategies that work. There's some others that mean your whole lesson plan will disintegrate. And you could see with stark separation, there were some students who got it. They knew how to work with that kind of kid, and you could go, you know what, you can go into a tough community, you're going to be fine. And then there were others where it was, my beautiful lesson plan is destroyed and I don't know what to do. And they'd start making arithmetic mistakes and the whole thing would just come, crashing like a souffle that's been dropped on the floor. It's a tough test, but it's a fair test. It's looking for what you really need on something like that. So on the other additions that impressed me, I won't tell you stories from all of them because we've got a lot of ground to cover. But the key point was look not just for, is there something about this person that dazzles, but can they work through all of the moment-to-moment issues? And when you come to technical fields, I come back to this notion of seeing how someone codes is instructive. In some ways, it's similar to my old world of hiring people who write. And there was no better way to judge someone than to give them a practice story assignment. And we'd put them on a contract and pay them something for it. But the result is you see not just what the finished draft looks like, but how long does it take them to do it? How many mistakes and iterations does it go through? Are these honest mistakes where you go, you know what, that's easily fixed and it doesn't stress me? Or are these potentially catastrophic mistakes where you go, you know what, if we publish that, we'd be on the wrong end of a lawsuit or we'd be, hurting our reputation? How well do people handle all the interpersonal stuff on a project too? In coding, what's your annotation look like? Does that tell another person enough to understand how you wrote the program the way you did and for them to make any adjustments that they need to? In journalism, the same thing. Are you wrapping up your interviews with people on a basis that they were comfortable talking to you? Or have you trampled on a lot of people and you've got people complaining that you took things out of context and the like? You learn a lot that way. So it's harder in non-performance fields to come up with ways to do auditions, but I think there are new opportunities coming up. In sales, there's, having people do presentations, you can tell who presents well and who doesn't. But moving out of just the conference room interview to something that more closely approximates what people do, and the best way to get the right people for the job is to see them on the job, as opposed to trying to extrapolate from what are more artificial situations.
Yeah, I think we have a mini version of auditions here where we bring people in for on-site interviews, and I think on the technical side we do ask them to code, but I think we're also checking for what we call Googliness, or kind of culture fit. So, one of the stories you profile in your book is about the FBI, who has a rule about, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on authors of Google, but basically they don't want to hire any a-holes, and that's the single hiring criteria that guy uses, no a-holes, and then he selected everything on top of that. And so, what are some of the things that we want to do slightly better than that? We actually want them to be nice and googly, and I sometimes talk about the people that I interview, when I don't want the interview to end and I want to take them to lunch afterwards, that's a good sign. So are there other things that we can look at when they come on site to interview that are some glimpse into their personality? What can we better use that audition for other than kind of raw technical skills?
So I like the idea of having a culture that has a name. I get to visit a lot of organizations, and I'd say simply by knowing that you want people with the right amount of Googliness, you're ahead of 2/3 of the companies. And it's always sad to come into a place where there isn't a defining culture, where it's just, turn in the work and try not to get yelled at by your boss or by the CEO or by the controlling shareholders or what have you. And it's more a defensive culture where there isn't a unique way of doing things. So I think merely by thinking about Googliness, you're taking an important step beyond what other people do. In terms of how you draw that out in an interview, I've always believed you learn different things about people in different settings, that we have one persona that we bring into conference room conversations. We have a slightly different persona over lunch. We have a different persona when we go for a walk with someone. And I think giving people a chance to show more of the different aspects of themselves. Reference checks, there's perfunctory reference checks that get you almost nothing. They're the ones much more detailed. A question that I always found elicited the most interesting things was to ask, what advice can you give me about how to manage this person effectively? Because it's very neutral, but it's also the way that some of the failure or stress issues come up of, whatever you do, don't criticize this person in public because they'll go ballistic and they'll start screaming and shouting and throwing stuff. And you go, okay, that's a good tool to know, but it also tells me something about temper that I otherwise wouldn't have been told. So that's one way to draw out. In Googliness, I always think part of it is this endless, insatiable curiosity that goes in a lot of directions, and this desire to find the non-obvious solution that, stretching the frontiers of knowledge. So I would think that would come up pretty quickly in a conversation, that you can tell whether you're dealing with someone who's, a by the book, here's what I learned in the textbook, or here's what I think the next edition of the textbook ought to say. But give yourselves credit. You've done an extraordinary job of hiring, and every time I meet people from Google in almost any setting, I'm impressed, not just with how smart they are, but how wide their contributions can be.
So it's kind of a special group to select for that you devote some time at the end of the book for, is about picking the boss. And we have some people here who are leadership recruiters and specifically trying to find the next Larry, the next Sergey. So tell us a little bit about, I found a lot of the stuff in the book really counterintuitive about, I would have never guessed that that's a better way to pick a boss. Who are the best people at picking bosses, and what do they do?
So when you get all the way up to the boardroom, there's an interesting question of whether you can both be the recruiter and the assessor. And I think one of the challenges, I spent some time on CEO searches, which you'd think would go as well as anything. We could certainly invest more money, more time, more advice, deeper due diligence, and yet those tend to be some of the most frustrating ones. They sometimes blow up quite spectacularly. And I think the challenge there is that boards, when they're looking at candidates, are so eager to close the deal at a certain point that the who's selling who relationship inverts. And instead of trying to get the candidate to show you all of their strengths and anything else you need to know about them, pretty soon it's the company trying to woo the candidate. And the higher up you go in the power ladder, the better your candidate is going to be at this. And remember, you're looking for leadership, and part of leadership is turning your meeting into their meeting. So and I did a profile years ago of Joe Batchelder, who's America's #1 compensation attorney. And he said anytime he would go in to negotiate compensation for a new CEO with the general counsel, he knew he could get anything he wanted. Because pretty soon, when the deal was over, that general counsel was going to have to report to this new incoming CEO. And anything that he'd said no to, maybe we need a new general counsel. And he could play on that slight edge of fear quite skillfully, so that, more restricted stock, more options, bigger moving allowance, shorter vesting period. All the dominoes just came down one after another. And that's a hard position to be in. In the book, I spend some time about, is it worth outsourcing some level of the due diligence on the candidate? Because then you've got this neutral party that's doing the 4-hour career interview, that's doing the deep dive, and that's picking over not just the trophy moments of someone's career, but also the times that were bumpy, and looking for some of the interpersonal flags that can come up of, yes, you met target, but you ended up with a lot of unhappy people along the way, and, maybe you had legal exposure, maybe you had other things. So that would be one area where I think the higher up you go, the more argument there is for bringing in outside assessors who can, play that neutral role. And, beyond that, there's a Steve Kaplan study from the University of Chicago that I found quite impressive, where he looks at how successful executives score on various measures of effectiveness. judged by their eventual performance on the job. And he found efficiency, accountability, generally hard virtues as opposed to likability, tended to be the ones that drove performance. And we all like to think of bosses as ultimately inspiring people who we like and love and cherish. But I think his point was you need to earn that first by delivering on the job. And if you look only for likability, you can end up with some people who either don't set ambitious goals or who tend to either be too eager to please everyone to the point where there aren't strong priorities, there aren't tough decisions. So it was a bit of a tough love message, but I think in terms of getting the absolute best results, he's got a point.
So I want to read a passage from the book that I think would be particularly relevant to Google here. So what you write is, as organizations grow older, a lot of that exuberance of kind of the early days fades. Familiar paths for adding talent get established. Leaders become more certain about which types of people they want and which they don't want. Cultures turn more conservative. Unfamiliar ideas of any sort, particularly ones involving what might seem like oddball hires for important jobs, are more likely to be viewed with suspicion or disdain. So I think a lot of us here are worried that will happen as Google now is approaching 30,000 people and is not exactly the small startup we used to be. So how do we keep this from happening? What can Google do to not have that, not become more conservative, not just keep on the same path that we've been doing in the past?
So Todd was good enough to give me a heads up on a couple questions coming, and I want to share a piece of Valley history that always struck me. If you go back to Hewlett-Packard, which to some extent defined Valley culture or the best of Valley culture for several decades, I was always impressed in the 1980s that their big breakthrough, the thing that gave them a second or third lease on life, was the work they did in printers. And that came out of San Diego, and that came out of Boise, not out of Palo Alto. And I think that ability to get smart people away from headquarters trying new things is hugely important. And in fact, if you look at the early inkjet printers, they were a mess. I mean, they were very blotchy, they were poor resolution. It was, for a couple of years, an inferior product. But coming back to our conversation about, gauge the upside, look for the opportunity. That's true of products as well as people. And the early pioneers on this in Boise were saying, you know what, we will get those dots closer together. A couple more product cycles, and we will have a printer you can be proud of, and it will be able to print in color, and it'll have a much faster run rate, and it'll be a lower cost one. And they were stubborn enough to stick it out and ultimately build a multi-billion dollar business in spite of a very bumpy meeting in 1984 where the guys at headquarters said, I'm not sure we should be putting this much into it. And it took ultimately support from the CEO to say, yes, we should. And I think one of the exciting things about coming into Google is getting a sense of how much you're spreading around the globe. And I would hope that some of the labs that you're setting up, and whether it's Israel or Singapore or other places, are not just filling in the details for projects here, but are looking for big new ideas and bringing in the kinds of talent that is free of whatever those pressures for conformity may be at headquarters. I mean, I'm sure there will be great things that happen at headquarters too, but I think the ability to have a global presence and to have idea factories, skunkworks, incubator labs that sometimes can try new things because they aren't as tightly watched and they're a little bit more free to stumble around and make those kinds of experiments and early missteps that are part of how most big breakthroughs happen. I think that can be crucial.
So we should start making printers? Is that your suggestion?
There's still good money in printers, yes.
You heard it here. How about just specifically in selection? So Larry's always pushing us to think for the next idea that's going to affect 1 billion people. And we don't quite get 1 billion people applying to Google every year, but pretty close. And I mean, from selection, let's say you have no constraints for money, no constraints for time, let's say even no legal constraints. What are some of the crazy things that we could try, given that we're Google and we have a founder that's not an issue for him going think bigger? That's fine. We need big, bold ideas. What's something that you did some research on, you found that you think somebody with Google scale, interesting people, technology, what's our next $1 billion idea for selecting people? No pressure.
There are an awful lot of us who use Google products, and something about us. It generally tends to be anonymized, but since you took legal constraints off the table, what can you discover from the way people use you that say, you know what, you ought to be part of Team Google? There may be a million reasons why that idea will go nowhere, but it is an interesting question. That are you finding people whose own pursuits within the Google universe are the kind that catch your eye? Is that mischievous enough for you? Does that send your lawyers into palpitations?
I'll ask them after the talk, but
okay.
That's pretty good. Why don't we start to open it up to folks in the crowd? I know we have a lot of folks who are in recruiting, a lot of people who spend a lot of time looking at resumes. If you guys have any questions, come up to the mic.
So I've been in staffing for quite some time. There's a lot of negative stigma around recruiters in general and staffing. People love to blame recruiters and staffing process in a lot of ways for not getting a job or for however the system breaks down. Did you find that in your research? And if so, what did you find?
So which direction is the arrow pointing? Is this talking about candidates who feel that the recruiters didn't, or
candidates, hiring managers, people that aren't part of a staffing organization?
Okay, so you're looking at both sides of the equation, and
right.
You're in this challenging position of being the coupler
right.
of a lot of people who may not ever couple or may feel that the coupling should have worked on their end and it's the other guy's fault that
right.
it didn't.
Right.
I think a little bit of that comes with the territory, and you're in some cases you're expected to do the impossible. Whether it's a very hard search to fill or to bring people's expectations up high enough that they become legitimate candidates and then somehow manage the descent back down. I think a bit of that has to be just plain lived with. I think as we move to a world where there's more data that can be shared you might be able to have more transparency going into the company of here's what we do. You probably don't want to have more transparency going out to the candidate because that exposes you to all sorts of legal risks. I think we just have to live with the fact that job searches are a bit of a black box, and as much as people say they want feedback, in some cases they don't really. They just want affirmation. So in an ideal world you wouldn't have those sources of friction, but I think some of that may just come with the job. It's what makes it a high-skill job that requires really bright people with a real eye for the situation. I mean, if you could take out all of the human stress, you'd probably have a job that could be automated and offshored, and you don't. Yeah.
As a company like Google gets big, it develops certain processes for, for hiring, for interviewing that may go against what you've said about being able to be creative and looking at the different sort of candidates. If they don't perhaps fit into a mold or a process that may say, okay, well, we're going to look at this first and this. And for example, you may focus too much on how does the candidate do in the interview setting and less on what this candidate's experience is over time that they bring to us. How would you suggest a company avoid falling to that trap?
So Google being a company that has a good appreciation of data, I would think the way you police yourself is to look at performance of people on the basis of how they scored during the process and then what you know a year or two later and see what kinds of metrics are helping you find great people and what ones are not. I know from my journalism days, one organization I worked with, there was a painful drop in the quality of hires when examination of writing samples took a back seat to how well people communicated in interviews. And for about a year, we hired a whole lot of very charming people who couldn't write worth a damn. And in the end, we're not hiring people to make nice conversation with a hiring editor for an hour. We're hiring people to do great work for a year. And I think probably in technical fields, that's doubly and triply true. And you need some mechanism of knowing what am I really looking for in the interview, as opposed to what's distracting levels of social connection or non-social connection. There's one organization that takes everyone out to lunch afterward and uses that as a way to gauge people's sociability. And I said, has anyone ever flunked the lunch test? And they said, no. Everyone passes the lunch test. They're all likable in some lunch setting. I go, are you really getting anything useful then? then it may become a sales technique. It may be part of how you win the person over to come work for you. But I think, particularly in technical fields, figuring out what you're wanting to accomplish with the social niceties of an interview versus what's actually irrelevant to the job is important. Does that answer some of
I
what
think
you're
that addresses part of it. Some of it is really a question about how individuals in a larger setting can kind of buck the tide of, okay, this is the way we do it, this is the path that we evaluate people, and maybe I think you made a good point about evaluating the people we have brought on. That doesn't address some very good people that we may choose to not bring on because they didn't fit our predefined notion of how to hire somebody.
That's a very good point, that the road less taken is hard to see. I mean, one of the things I do with the book is put forth the concept of the jagged resume, so at least we've got terminology. And I think it's harder when you can't even explain what you're going at. So I've got it into Harvard Business Review now. I'm working to spread this very simple but I think very powerful idea and make it part of the conversation. Yeah.
Can you talk more about the winning over a candidate from the candidate perspective? Especially for established places to find talent. There's a big talent crunch in our space, and people know we're hiring, people know Google, but what are some interesting things you saw in winning candidates over?
So I do a section in chapter 9 about how Johns Hopkins brings people into its surgery residency program, and there, surgeons see themselves as top guns in the world of doctors, and Johns Hopkins sees itself as a top gun school. And what impressed me there was the ability to get people to believe in something larger than themselves. That it wasn't we pay you the most, or you get to get the shiniest cadavers or whatever. And it ends up being you are part of a great unbroken century-long tradition of innovation in medicine that goes all the way back to William Halsted. And this is the place where the great doctors of the future are formed, and you will be surrounded by peers and colleagues who will help you become an extraordinary healer to the world. And it's a difficult thing to pull off. I mean, if you overstate your case, it's easy to see who's sort of talking up a story without making good on it. But I would say that ability to inspire the best and brightest with a sense of this is an extraordinary community that you're coming into. That people want to tie into an organization. They don't want to be just sort of solo spores floating around. I've looked at some research studies on task-centered cultures versus people-centered cultures, and people stay longer in people-centered cultures, including the very best ones, and that ability to build those connections. But I think that has to be done deliberately, and it has to be done thoughtfully. It can't just happen overnight. Yeah.
So I really liked what you said about getting smart people away from headquarters and doing new things. And so I think it's pretty fair to say that when people come to Google, they don't want to leave for the most part. And so I certainly fit that bill. But I do have a very jagged resume before Google. So how would you position yourself if you found yourself in a company that was as amazing as Google for internal movement, knowing that now that you are in one role that you've been successful in, you don't want to be pigeonholed into just that role?
Doesn't it always come down to that ability to make one or two personal connections that you need to have a champion somewhere? And an awful lot of hiring is done on who do I believe could do the job, as opposed to I have 20 pieces of paper in front of me and I shuffled them and this one's ahead of the other 19. So I think that ability to find the team that you want to be on, get to know the people there, and hopefully impress them with your ideas, what you could do, how you could build it out. It's a challenge because we live in a world where credentials matter, and some of them are excellent credentials and some of them are artificial. And I'm finding this to a huge degree with people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. They've had some extraordinary skill development in terms of mobilizing people, running facilities, safety programs, the like, but they haven't picked up the civil engineering letters that go after their name. So it's hard to know what to do with them. But I'd say there's no substitute for just finding the people you want to work with and getting known to them.
So at a company of our size, there might be people who apply to a role thinking that this is what would be good for them, but actually they'd be a really great fit for somewhere else in the company that they would never think to apply to. And I wonder, in your research, did you come across any talent scouts or evaluators that said, they came across looking in one context and said, you're not good for, you're not right for this, but actually maybe somewhere else is the right place for you, or maybe you'd be good somewhere else, and just sort of taking off the blinders of what you're looking for to see if there's another place. And I just wonder if you came across any scenarios like that, and if there's any lessons to be learned about how to facilitate that better.
So you're getting into the very challenging world of internal talent movement. And on this book, I concentrated mostly on the external side. Who do you bring into your organization? But you're absolutely right. Some of the internal challenges are just as big and sometimes bigger. And in a way, what we know and don't know about our own people can be quite jarring. And when you're under 150 people, you meet everyone. There are all-site events, so it's not too hard to kind of quietly explore in both directions. I'm looking for someone who could do this, or I'd like a chance to try something else. I think it just gets harder when the teams get bigger. I wish there were some way of solving that. I don't know whether a professional version of social networks starts to surface people like that, and you can even just analyze their postings and see where they might have untapped skills. But I think you're going to have to, when you get to be 30,000 people, you almost have to solve that automatically and through some sort of filtering and sorting system. It's just too hard to knit the person-to-person connections together, and it's a big problem. And we have an awful lot. IBM struggles with this. They have no end of talented people who are stuck in the wrong jobs, and then the question is, how do we get you to the right job? And they're still working on it.
Could be your next book.
This might not work. So a lot of your earlier examples revolve around an individual recognizing, that slight flutter and taking a risk on a unique candidate and having them end up doing really well. Do you think that putting candidates through multiple interviewers and multiple levels of approval means that those people with the jagged resumes fall out of the process? And, as organizations grow, how do we scale that appetite for risk so that we don't lose them?
That's a big peril. I'm glad you put your finger on it. That as we sort of average in scores, there's the risk that we're very good at getting the second decile of people, that we know how to weed out the bottom 70 or 80%, but that there's some really interesting people at the top of the pool who don't present quite the way we expected, and pass them around to enough different people, and someone will say no. I guess a way you could adjust for it is to give someone super voting powers every now and then, and to say, you know what, I feel so strongly about this person that even though I haven't won the rest of the team over, I want this to be my bet for the year, and some ability to avoid sort of blending down scores to the point where you're just hiring the same person in the middle all the time. But that's an interesting challenge. I'm not sure whether that would work every time or whether the mismatches would be there or not. But you're right, you can take people around to so many stations that in the end you lose individuality. Yes?
So my question was around the big crazy ideas. So I think that there's a lot of crazy things that we try to do with our selection processes, but a big challenge that we face is the effect that doing a crazy idea might have on our employment brand. So if people are like, oh, well, Google's making me do X, Y, Z, I hate Google because of it or whatever. So I was wondering if you've seen in your research any of these kind of out-of-the-box selection techniques that either move the needle really in a positive way on a company's employment brand or in a negative way on a company's employment brand.
Isn't it always better to try those somewhere where you can prototype a little bit out of the spotlight and find one state, one country, one division where you can go, okay, this is only a limited test. I mean, the consumer products people do it all the time with virtually every product, and that way they know which their interesting ideas are, and then they extend them out for the whole world, and they let go of the problematic ones. I was talking with someone who runs the Presidential Fellows Program, and that's sort of a government approach of you don't want to upend the whole civil service system, and in fact, you'd create untold problems if you did. But you like to have sort of these interesting, small, parallel hiring systems that do look at sort of something more than just the traditional evaluation methods. Do you have anything in particular, a crazy idea that's almost worth trying, but you're not sure whether to jump forward or not?
Yeah, I think that we try them, and we almost always do it in that way with pilot groups, and then we find ideas that work with a pilot group and have shown to be valid in terms of hiring, quality people or finding false negatives, but we have trouble implementing them across Google because there's this fear that it's, even though it helps us hire really good people, it's going to tarnish the Google brand, and it's something that people are super concerned about, especially since so many of our candidates are like our users and are really vocal already as it is about the process.
Yeah, I'd need to know more about where the resistance comes in, whether that's top management, whether that's operating people, where your sticking point is. But it seems like a well-run pilot ought to sell itself. And if you can show improved results, and this is a culture where, and then, data wins. And if your pilots really do come out that well, maybe it just takes a little longer to implement them, but they shouldn't be abandoned. It's kind of surprising.
Let's take one more question.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned that curiosity seems to be baked in and is something that can't really be learned. What about resilience? Are there situations where you see somebody doesn't seem particularly resilient, but if they're thrown into the fire or they're given the right situations, they really develop resilience, and so it's hard to tell up front?
Boy, that's an interesting one. I mean, I'd need to have a much stronger background in psychology to be able to tell you what's there for sure. I think in really cruel cultures, you can crush it in people, but hopefully none of us will live in a society where that's systematically done. They do exist. In terms of can people develop it partway through their career, I think it'd be hard to really build something that wasn't there at all. I mean, I think there are far more examples of people who haven't really learned to cope with failure well, and when something goes off course for them, they just have a hard time regrouping. I mean, a lot of the long-term unemployed now are people who got settled into a career, felt they did it well, their industry went south, and they can't figure out how to reinvent themselves. And it's hard. I mean, the first year will not be better than the old system was, and it may take 2 or 3 years to hit that break-even point. But some people just have that ability to bounce back. I would think that would be a hard skill to train. I would think that would be more innate. But again, I'll defer to the experts if they have other findings.
All right, well, I want to thank George for coming in and kind of leave you guys with a challenge that's there. As you can see from the questions, there's a lot of appetite for trying crazy things, and that's what Google is known for. But then we don't want to become the giant, boring, bureaucratic process that we're worried about. So take a look at some of the ideas you've heard today. Take a look. We have some books for sale, and find what I'll sort of say a 1% project, right? Find something that we can tweak 1% of the hiring here, experiment a little bit, try something crazy, break something, and see if something interesting and cool comes out of it. So my biggest thing reading through the book is, if I was allowed to break 1% of hiring, there's like 10 interesting ideas in here to do it. So if you're interested in that, check out the book, come talk to me. I'm happy to help you guys break our hiring a little bit. Hopefully the lawyers aren't watching this right now. And hope it just gets your mind thinking about new ways to do hiring for Google. So thanks again, George.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.